Beyond Utopias, Urban Landscapes in Pelo Malo. Pelo Malo is the second feature film by the Venezuelan director, Mariana Rondon. It is also her best known. Oh, and by the way, I just want to apologize in advance if the English doesn't sound all great. This is my own translation and it's quite rough. I didn't have a chance to ask some of my native speaker friends and colleagues to look it up. So if you hear something that sounds weird, it's probably because of my translation. All right. Okay. So the film was awarded La Concha de Oro, that is the best film prize at the San Sebastian International Film Festival in 2013, and the awards for Best Director and Best Script at the Mar del Plata International Film Festival in the same year. The story centers on the conflict between Junior, a 9-year-old boy, and Marta, his mother. Junior has kinky hair, commonly called in Venezuela pelo malo, in English, bad hair, hence the title of the film, and wants to straighten it for the school photo, which will be taken at the beginning of the school year. Her mother interprets this desire as a deviation from the heteronormative expectations. As a result, Marta distances herself from Junior despite the boy's constant efforts to gain her love and approval. The aggressiveness of the mother, exacerbated by her precarious personal and economic status. Marta has recently become a widow and has lost her job, although none of this is clearly mentioned in the movie. We kind of gather this as we watch the film. Sorry. So is constructed mainly as a reaction to her perception of Junior's homosexuality. The image that Marta builds of her son is also conditioned by her racialized view of the child. She sees her bad hair as an inheritance from his Black grandmother. Marta, who with brown but lighter skin, perceives this as problematic, which only adds to her discomfort around Junior. This attitude contrasts with Marta's attitude towards her other son, who is just a baby, who has lighter skin and straight hair like hers. Pelo Malo has been the subject of numerous articles, most of which have focused on the study of Junior's sexual and racial identity, especially in view of Marta's rejection. The emphasis on individual and private experiences, seemingly at the expense of a public and collective perspective, compounded with Rondon's critical stance towards the Chavez government, made Pelo Malo the target of strong criticism in Venezuela, to the point that Rondon received death threats and accusation of betraying her homeland. Government officials and fellow artists delegitimize her representation of contemporary Venezuela, demonstrating this criticism, demonstrating a simplistic understanding of the workings of the Venezuelan film platform. And the Venezuelan film platform is a collection of laws that were passed in the last few years to promote Venezuelan filmmaking. Besides the political motivation for such negative reactions, the critiques appear anchored in the analytical approach proposed by the new Latin American cinema. This influential paradigm, proposed by filmmakers and critics in the 1960s, favors an aesthetic based on realism and historical accounts as the valid methodology to represent social struggle in film. As a consequence, it dismisses approximations based on personal histories, identity, gender, or emotions. Despite the Venezuelan response, most analysis of the film identified the political significance of Marta's contempt for Black culture, exemplifying her conflictive relationship with her mother-in-law and Junior's hair, or her paradoxical view of patriarchal structures displayed in Marta's active sexuality and non-conformist role with her work. She is a security guard, a job normally associated with men, but at the same time feels contempt for the sexuality she perceives in her son. Marta also submits to the sexual desires of her old boss in order to get her job back. There has also been a general recognition of the relevance of Junior's silences and glances, which emphasize his condition of triple marginality as a child, a racialized individual, and someone with a nonconformist sexuality. The confluence of these lines of inquiry have prompted to observe symbolic violence, the quietly unaccepted violence the characters will face as the most prominent route by which the political dimension appears in the film. However, not much has been said about the role of the city, despite Rondon's own words regarding housing developments in Venezuela. Apartment blocks, and this is Rondon's words, apartment blocks are still being constructed for the most vulnerable in society, but in my opinion, without any questioning of the things we already know didn't work some 40, 50, or 60 years ago. The utopia didn't work. What are we aiming for with such a practical consideration as the house of an individual? Where are you placing the person? What are you making of this existence for the future? What's being built here? As we will see in this quote, Rondon is making specific references to the buildings where Junior and Marta live. Therefore, we cannot ignore the social importance projected by the connection between characters and the urban spaces that surround them. From its first images, Pelo Malo establishes the filmic space as a fundamental factor in this dramatic and semantic structure. In this presentation, I will explore the political emergence of the public sphere through the representation of urban spaces found in a contemporary Venezuelan city. I will focus on a brief description of specific scenes in the film to illustrate the treatment of external spaces and their formulation as landscapes. The presentation is part of a larger work evaluating urban landscapes in several recent Venezuelan films, including Rondon's first film, Postales de Leningrado, Postcards from Leningrad, from 2007. Before moving into the analysis of the urban landscapes, it will be helpful to specify in some detail what I understand by landscape and the difference in the filmic sense between landscape and setting. In this respect, I will refer to the works of Martin Lefebvre from 2006 and 2011, and of Harper and Rainier from 2010. The idea of landscape comes from the visual arts. It is not clear at what specific moment in history nature becomes landscape, but for Lefebvre, this moment may date back to the Renaissance or possibly earlier. It is important to note that the transition from nature to landscape is defined by human intervention. It is humans who compose a landscape, who observe nature from a privileged point and with their gaze, if they are observers, or their intention, if they are creators, emancipated from the real to give it the status of a subject. There is therefore a fluidity between the landscape as an extension of nature and the landscape as an extension of human activity. It is as a function of this fluidity that Lefebvre ascribes an irrevocable significance to the human who inhabits a natural space. Harper and Rainier recognize human imagination as the mediating force that selects and orders the elements that compose a landscape, making it not only selective but never neutral in intention or reception. For them, depicted landscapes are often symbolic and frequently contribute to social formation, impacting upon human associations and societal norms. If the inhabitant of the natural space, by its very existence, manages to convert it into a landscape, we could assume that the dweller of the urban space converts it through a similar emancipatory operation into an urban landscape. As we may expect then, a definition of landscape needs to acknowledge different kinds of environments, from the rural to the urban, from the macro environment of expansive ecology to the micro environment of human habitation. For Lefebvre, the filmic arena facilitates a tension between the purely visual possibilities of the landscape and its dominating narrative potential. As a space for the action, the landscape reveals the specificity of human activity by focusing attention on the dwelling space. Since cinema is, for the most part, a narrative activity, natural spaces have been used mainly as frames for the action. In this way, we could consider a landscape in their pictorial sense becomes a stage, that is, one more element of the mise-en-scène that remains subordinate to the narrative. However, there are moments, according to Lefebvre, when these natural spaces become more than simply settings. He quotes the images of the American West in westerns like The Man from Laramie, 1955, The Last Frontier, again 1955, or A Man of the West, 1958, among films in which the representation of nature arrests the flow of the story. During these brief moments in which the action is suspended, the filmic image is transformed into the equivalent of a photographic image. Thus, in its pictorial quality, the filmic landscapes acquires autonomy from the dramatic structure. It separates itself from the narrative and ceases to be subordinated to the demands of the action to become the action itself. In this suspended state, the filmic landscape directs the action, giving it focus and meaning. When the natural spaces are emancipated and transcend the dimension of mere frameworks for the action, they encircle the characters, reduce their importance, and capture them as another element of the composition. Lethbridge sees in this takeover a certain level of nostalgia, a dimension that yearns for a possible return to nature, an ideal of contemplation that observes nature somehow frozen in the image. In Pelo Malo, the city is, no doubt, the stage for the action, but like the landscapes of the Westerns, its function moved beyond the theatrical. At once, the city controls the characters and their actions, arresting the narrative. Caracas emerges as an urban landscape, but unlike the natural landscapes envisioned by Lethbridge, there seems to be no nostalgia here, no desire to return to the past. The urban spaces in Pelo Malo forces a vision into the future, a chaotic and hostile future made of concrete and devoid of any chance to glimpse the comforting line of the horizon. That the action in Pelo Malo takes place in Caracas is not obvious at the beginning of the film. The first scenes are from inside the house where Marta is employed as a domestic worker. In this first sequence, although there is no reference to natural or urban landscapes, an important relationship is established between narration and space. A dissonance is created between the great white staircase of the house, which suggests a very high socioeconomic status, and the humble clothing of mother and son. And by the way, the painting of the black boy on the wall, I don't think it's casual, but I haven't explored that image, but well, it's there. For a brief moment, these stairs gain autonomy, and it is from the separation between background space and personal appearance that the cinematographic characters begin to take shape. With a similar tactic, a few minutes later, Junior enters the bathtub in the main bathroom. The camera focuses on the bathtub, then on the water, and finally on the child's face. There is a moment of ecstasy in Junior's expression, broken by the arrival of the owner of the house. And in this image, he sees the owner of the house entering the bathtub, and she's quite pissed. Again, for a few seconds, the action in the bathroom is suspended. In the contemplation of that halted space, the viewer begins to form an idea of Junior's identity and what this means for his mother. Although in this first minutes of the film, there are no reference to external spaces, the filmic strategy that gives autonomy to the staircase and the bathroom will be repeated throughout the film and will define the manipulation of urban spaces as landscapes deployed by Rondon. The first images of the city come from Junior's gaze as he travels silently on a bus beside his mother. And this is what he sees. The camera, from the child's perspective, collects images of the buildings, the city's traffic, and the emblematic El Ávila mountain. And you see that in the background. This hill has appeared in countless landscape paintings. Perhaps the most famous are those by Venezuelan painter Manuel Cabré. The inclusion of El Ávila not only responds to a clear narrative function to locate the story in Caracas, it also points to the intention of creating a comparative note, a symbolic remark of what can be captured by the camera. It is not by chance that this is the only time the image of the mountain appears clearly before the viewer. Instead of the natural monument, what will appear again and again are the buildings of the city, not the modern buildings from the affluent areas of Caracas. What we see frequently, both as settings and landscapes, are the large housing blocks of El 23 de Enero neighborhood. And this is an image from the movie. These buildings, 38 super blocks and 42 small blocks, are as emblematic for Caracas as El Ávila. The blocks built between 1955 and 1957 were designed by a team of architects led by Carlos Raúl Villanueva and inspired by Le Corbusier's famous Unité de Habitation. Villanueva's design sought to ideally integrate all spaces of urban life: housing, education, commerce, recreation. Over the decades, the utopia has faded, and for many years now, the area has become a microcosm of the ills that afflict the city: lack of resources, crime, violence, drug overpopulation. These buildings, like the hills and peaks of El Ávila, stand out like the silhouettes of a mountainous landscape. They are the reference in Rondon's earlier quote. When Marta and Junior get on the bus, she's frustrated because of what had happened at the house. They sit together, and Junior, as he views the city, starts humming a tune. The mother gets annoyed and moves to another seat. Martha's harsh judgment is patent. Junior, on the other hand, seems used to this treatment. The short interaction summarizes Martha's disapproval, while the editing of the scene shows the transition of the city from background to filmic landscape. And we'll see that clip. From the continuous and distant shot of the 23 de Enero blocks, taken from Junior's point of view on the bus, we move suddenly to a medium shot, quite short, of a woman in an apartment window. In voice off, Junior talks to his friend, La Niña, the girl, and that's the only name we know her, his friend, as La Niña. The children's voices indicate that we're no longer on the bus. Now we are on one of the balconies of the block where they live. The two children observe other blocks from their vantage point. In this scene, we have the impression of a panoramic vision. We'd even say that the children have a total vision that reminds us of Bentham and Foucault's panopticon. The idea of panoramic vision supposes a privileged position that in landscape theory implies the intention of isolating an external space in order to fix it in time. For Lethbridge, when this happens in cinema, the operation implies stopping the narrative and provoking a moment of aesthetic reflection. The two options, following the narration or contemplating an image, are considered mutually exclusive. This axiom, which appears logical if we contemplate an image, we cannot follow a narrative, is not based on any study of the psychology of the spectator. In fact, there's no apparent reason why both processes cannot occur at the same time. In the case of the balcony scene, the gaze of the characters, like the gaze of someone observing a landscape painting, gives meaning to the sequence. The narration does not stop completely, as Lefebvre would like. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it slows down. The decreased tempo enhances the scenic space beyond its background value and disrupts the narrative stream. While in the balcony, the children play a game that is both a function of who they are and where they are. The game is to observe the urban landscape and imagine what it means. Little rack, says Junior. Second downpipe, third floor, says the girl. Cigar, Junior says again. That easy. She's always waiting for his husband, replies the girl, who observes a woman smoking. Junior corrects. It's not the husband, it's the son. To which the girl responds, how come? I saw them kissing. The children play as if they were observing El Ávila from afar, imagining shapes and meanings in its shadows and contours. Later, towards the middle of the film, while reflecting on what to do with her son, Marta also observed the blocks from a balcony. Marta's view is very brief and at night. The landscape, dark as her mood, directs and defines the scene. In this sometimes cruel and sometimes playful contemplation of the landscape of El 23 de Enero, the political and collective dimension take hold of the film. As Maria Delgado says, the political is inflicted in the landscape and mood of the film. I'm thinking about the extraordinary buildings where Junior and his friend live. When Junior and La Niña leave the blocks and move around the housing complex, their movements are often recorded with long shots, the camera close to the ground, well below the line of sight, at a slightly low angle. And we'll see that shot, that clip.
Se me quedaron los zapatos, vamos a volver. No podemos, camina, no te quedes parada. ¿Y cómo me tomo la foto? Vamos, que nadie se puede quedar parado aquí. Pero mi mamá está viendo.
The two characters stay in focus, while the buildings behind them slowly become blurry. Objects close to the camera are always out of focus. The composition of the scene emphasizes the grandeur of the buildings and leaves the characters as one other element of the space. The blocks draw the outline of the sky as if they were the outline of the famous mountain. However, Rondon's approach is not to show El Ávila again after that first bus trip. Instead, she wants to show the children's environment as a landscape of concrete and metal where nature is reduced to a few and isolated brushes of greenery. Junior is not always seen in the housing complex. He leaves the blocks a few times, once with his mom to visit his grandmother, another to accompany Marta to look for work, and another to see a doctor. In these cases, the city functions mainly as a background for the action. The camera assumes a distant position with long and medium shots that capture the day-to-day traffic, the queues to get on the bus, the crowded sidewalks. Only on one occasion does Marta take her son to a space other than the city. Trying to get her old job back, Marta attends a company's party that takes place in an amusement water park with a prehistoric theme. Here, as in the blocks, everything is made of concrete, the trees only in the periphery. In Rondon's selection of spaces, we can observe how the film systematically ignores the natural spaces of Caracas and its surroundings, the mountains, the river, the beach, replacing them with landscapes centered on the city. Rondon's work is so meticulous that even in these walks outside El 23 de Enero, where the interaction between characters dominates the narration, and therefore it becomes difficult for the viewer to stop the image, the environment is not simply a stage. The coherence with which Rondon presents all spaces allows them to constantly move in and out of the landscape register to the extent that each space informs the behavior and social condition of the characters. The film ends with a high-angle establishing shot of Junior's schoolyard. It is the first day of school. The children are lined up in the distance. The roof of the classrooms form a field of concrete. A few meters beyond, the imposing masses of the blocks rise. It's an overwhelming landscape that allows us to anticipate, even though the shot lasts only 10 seconds, the resolution of the film. Junior has cut his hair and remains silent as his teammates sing the national anthem before entering the school, a last act of rebellion that corroborates his inability to enunciate a defense for his identity. I would like to close this descriptive analysis by commenting on the closing credits sequence. Throughout the film, Junior has wanted to straighten his hair to pose as a singer for the school photo. His grandmother teaches him the song Limón Limonero, a 1968 hit by Venezuelan singer Henry Stephen, and prepares a frills shirt for him in the same style worn by Stephen. The boy immediately rejects the shirt because he associates the frills with a feminine garment. But in the credits, Junior finally not only sings Limón Limonero with his hair straightened, he wears the shirt. And this is the part of the credit sequence.
Mi limón, mi limonera, entera. Says you, oh la la. Come on. Venga.
The background for his performance is a blue chroma. While Junior sings, the chroma is empty, but on several occasions the frame freezes like a photograph, and the image of the angel falls appear on the chroma. The falls are a natural space that is as recognizable for Venezuela as El Ávila is for Caracas. This playful coda confirms our assumption of the importance Rondon puts on reimagining the city as a landscape. It also gives Junior, although already out of diegesis, the opportunity to get out of the urban environment. Pelo Malo is a film that includes large outdoor spaces almost exclusively in Caracas. When watching the film, we might think that the city is devoid of natural spaces, and yet these urban spaces are often presented as landscapes where images of the huge housing blocks of El 23 de Enero slow down the narrative to almost a complete stop. Such suspension forces a moment of contemplation that informs the meaning of the action and directs the viewer's attention to Junior's dispossessed and marginal position. The urban landscapes of Pelo Malo envelop the characters, highlighting a hostile environment that leaves them on the fringes of any political or social utopia. Thank you very much.